Thank you, and good morning. So yes, this is the first panel of the morning. We'd like it to be interactive. I'll ask several questions for the panelists, but then I'll open it up for you as well. And so as Jason said, my title is Head of Enterprise Data Transformation at SAP. It is actually a customer-facing role, but prior to this role, I spent 7 years internally. I was SAP's Chief Data Officer, although we didn't call it quite that title. And so it's pretty appropriate that the first panel of the morning is going to be with Chief Data Officers, especially given the light of what this whole conference is about, right? It's about transforming government through data-driven insights, and who better than the Chief Data Officer to be in the middle of that, right? The Chief Data Officer is certainly all about data, and it's a position that's growing not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. There was a recent article in Fortune magazine that said kind of the top 1,000 companies, 2/3 of them already have chief data officers, and that trend is growing. And certainly in the public sector as well, not only the federal but the state and city governments are also seeing these roles emerge. So it's great to be able to talk with other chief data officers, as well as talk about a very interesting topic, which is the culture within organizations and how to drive a data-driven culture. But before we do, let me just turn it over to each of the panelists so that they could, in addition to their title, talk a little bit about your experiences, your organization, and kind of what brought you to the job. So Teresa, if you could start.
Good morning, I'm Teresa Smith. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the Defense Logistics Agency. Also, the director of our Strategic Data Services organization. To give you some scope, DLA is the logistics arm of the Department of Defense. We are a $35 billion business, bringing $35 billion in revenue each year. We are actively managing about 270 million contracts at any given time across 12,000 suppliers. We have 8 supply chains. We do everything from processing the orders from our warfighters to buying the material to delivering and working with Transcom on that, and then the disposition and disposal of excess. For our IT component, we support not only DLA but also Department of Defense and other federal agencies, and on each day we support about 4 million customers across 63 countries, so we're a vast organization. My personal background, I was trained, grew up, educated in logistics, so I am a loggy by trade. I've been the Chief Data Officer. It's a new position for DLA, about a year and a half. First one, so I was able to kind of make it my own. There were some errors along the way, but we are a growing organization, and this is, as Maria said, this is just an area that is exploding. Yeah. So it's an exciting time. So thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Tom?
Hi, good morning. I am Tom Cicela. I'm the Director of Operations and Architecture for this U.S. Army CIG-6 and the Chief Data Officer for the entire Army. So in that role, or in that capacity, I have 3 primary roles. I am the Chief Architect for the Enterprise Mission Area, which is all of our cross-cutting IT portfolios. I am the Chief Integrator of all architectures across the entire Army, and as well as the Chief Data Officer, which is what I call the horizontal of data across all of the mission areas. And so for the Department of Defense, for those who don't know, there are 4 mission areas: the business, warfighting, intelligence, and enterprise mission area. So the Army's a small organization-ish. It is the largest of the military departments, about 1.1 million people in the U.S. Army. Oh, wow. Active duty and reservists and soldiers really make up about almost 2/3, 7/8 of the Army, if you want to look at it that way. And the civilian force is about 200,000 of the 1.1 million people. So the CDO position was established in 2009 in the Army. We were the first military department, one of the first federal agencies. Some debate about whether or not we were the first or not, but it was a pretty forward-leaning, in my opinion, of the U.S. Army to establish the position, and we've established kind of a governance construct around the data within the Army, and worked closely with the DoD CIO on kind of how they're doing data management as well. But the position was vacant for about 3.5 years. And so I've been now in the position for about a year and change, a year and 3 months or 4 months or so, whatever it might be. So we're trying to reanimate the entire program and kind of get it back into movement. And we were just talking back in the room about the Air Force has one now, the Navy may or may not. If they don't, they're close. If they do, then I guess they just did it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about this, and data's become very interesting to the U.S. Army. In fact, the Chief of Staff of the Army, highest ranking military officer in the Army, has created this new program called the Senior Leader Dashboard, which is really effectively a data fusion platform that he wants to have access to all the data in the Army. There's air quotes for a reason. So that's my latest challenge among many others.
Yeah, and I think for me, my observation, having been in the private sector as a chief data officer several times, the difference between the private and the public sector is just the scale. I mean, the scale of what you all have to do, the massive amounts of data, the number of people that have to be coordinated, departments that have to share information and coordinate across. So it's certainly a very challenging role, right?
Yeah, well, it is. And so, talking about sharing data, we are, I don't know, we're somewhat parochial about that. And that has been a lot of the talk across the department now, is how we better share data. In DLA, we process 7 billion transactions for the whole department. We don't even leverage, we have not historically leveraged exploring and mining that data to give us insights. And our systems don't talk to each other necessarily, and even within our each individual department or agency, we have multiple systems that don't necessarily talk to each other. So that is a significant challenge, and one that we're working through to overcome. How do we address that, and how do we make the most of the vast amount of information that we have?
So going back to the kind of the title of this talk, which is the impact of a data-driven culture, right? What's your definition? And data-driven culture is a term that's now thrown around a lot, just like a data is an asset, right? So what is it? What does that mean to you? What does that terminology, data-driven culture, mean to you? And what do you think are some of the inhibitors to achieving that?
I think it's certainly about making data accessible, but it's what we do with the data. That's where the value is. And I've said, and before I took this position, I was the lead for business process and analytics for DLA Aviation, which is our a supply chain that manages all aviation parts and components. And we did a great job of of diagnostic and descriptive analytics. We could go into our agency performance review and tell you what our metric was and give you every reason why, if this hadn't happened, we could have been 2 percentage points higher. We had that covered. We don't do the prescriptive and the predictive analytics, and that's what today's technology gives us. So for me, the data-driven organization it's definitely about making data accessible and putting the governance and the framework around that, but it's what we do with the data, making sure that we're using those insights to make fact-based decisions. We're not operating off of our gut and looking in the rear view mirror, but what can we do and what insights that we can we get out of that to help us grow and find business value, and for us ultimately provide better support to the warfighter.
Yeah. Tom, how about you?
So the Army, the DoD writ large, but I think the Army's kind of an interesting organization. So we have a tremendous amount of data, as I'm sure most people do, right? And so our challenge is harnessing it, as you mentioned, right? So I created this kind of PowerPoint presentation to educate the senior leaders on what it really means to have a culture around data, right? And so at the bottom, is this accessibility of the data, right? And then the next level up is actually what I'm calling the integration or the fusion of the data, right? You got to put all these different systems together. And look, that's really hard for us because they were not designed to do this. Many of these systems have been around for years and decades, if not multi-decades, right? And then on top is really the data analytics, is making the data useful, right? Not only getting it to the people that need the information, right, but getting the results of the analysis to the people that need the information, right? And then we have to sprinkle on there is what I'm calling the veracity and the confidence level of the data, right? So we see this all the time, and it's very downplayed in many cases. People are making decisions on data that is of questionable source and value, right? And that's really hard to characterize in a real way. And so think about this. So you got a bunch of data sources. Some may be authoritative, some may not. You fuse them together. You create a new data value out of that, right? And then you take that and you fuse it with something else, right? And then you allow someone to make a decision on that, not knowing where those data sources are. So when I was in the intelligence community, we faced this a lot, where we really had a couple authoritative sources for like all source reporting or human intelligence or IMINT or something like this. So that was kind of obvious. But when you got an all source report that had 27 pages of footnotes of where all this information came from, well, which do you really believe it, right? So I think there's great value in machine learning and deep learning and all this business, but I'm asking all of you all to consider, do you really trust the algorithms? Or do you trust the data the algorithms were learned on or built on, right? And from an Army perspective, I just want to challenge all of you to help us unleash our data. But once we unleash it, right, then you know what happens, right? It's everywhere. And we got to fuse it back together, and we got to kind of turn it into something that's useful. And I say this all the time, a dashboard is not analytics, right? So
Exactly.
that's really important to me, and I've been doing data now for about 20 years in various capacities as well as architecture, but it's really kind of challenging to me to explain to people what it really means to have a truly data-aware environment. And so, APIs to get the data in and out of the systems is really important. We have one system that we've recently deployed, COTS-based product that I call a roach motel for data, right? It goes in, it never comes out, right? That's not what we're looking for, right? So I was encouraged by your little microservices thing up there in the slide. So.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, Tom Redding, had just recently wrote an article that says, bad data leads to bad robots. So we all sort of think that AI is going to be the answer, but it's all based on the data that makes those calculations. So that's certainly a good point. And I think from my experience, I think the data-driven culture is really all about not just the use of data, but having your employees, citizens understand the importance of good data and what is their role in making sure that data is good. Like when you're entering information into, a record, I certainly do it as well. I just want to do it fast, and sometimes I don't put the most accurate information. But downstream, the fact that I did not have good data is really impactful in processes. And so it's how do you get the community of people, the knowledge worker, to value their role in data management and to make, and that's when I would know I would have a data-driven culture, is when everybody accepts their role in data management, not just the data team,
well, right.
The analytics.
Capturing the data at the point of entry, right? So I think it's interesting because it might be second nature to most people in a room where you are inputting data into a system. That's not how a lot of the Department of Defense works, right? This just happened. I got a new computer, right? And they gave me a little piece of paper I had to sign saying I got the computer. And then someone is going to transcribe that information into this mystical system called PBOOS, which is our property book management system, right? I'm going with 50% accuracy on whatever they put into the system, but my name's assigned against it. I'm sure I can log into PBOOS somehow and get an account, which is another data management problem, right? Yeah. Look at it, but I'm like, shouldn't, like we did here, you all signed in on the iPad, right? Well, couldn't they just swipe my CAC and say, hey, I own the computer now, and boop the barcode on the back of it, right? Yeah. And you talk about, the logistics, right? This is a logistics nightmare, and we just went through Win 10 upgrade. Anyone Win 10?
We did.
Yeah. So we replaced, we upgraded 958,000 computers for our office IT infrastructure. We literally purchased over 380,000 new computers, which is more computers than the entire Marine Corps has total, right? Where did all the old ones go? I asked. No one really knows. I think they're going to end up in your warehouse.
Yeah, they might be. We're probably putting them on a surplus sale out there somewhere.
I mean, some of them are relatively new, and I said there's going to be a bunch of schools and universities who benefit from this, right? Yes. Or disenfranchised youth or whatever, whatever you want to call them, right? So, but this is the challenge of if we had that data and it was electronic. And the other thing I'll point to is within the Army, these things called unit status reports, right? The Army gauges readiness every week through a unit status report, which is a piece of paper that someone transcribes and then pulls together into a spreadsheet that gets sent to the commander validates, and then gets rolled up at the brigade and the battalion and all the different echelons up to the chief of staff, and the chief of staff says, we're ready. Are we? So challenge to all of you, how do we fix that problem?
Yeah.
Point of entry all the way up to the point of consumption,
Yeah, exactly.
right? And through the different levels, controlling access to data privacy, we have an aggregation problem in the Department of Defense. You put too many things together, it becomes a little bit more sensitive than we want people to know. Although I just read our entire budget on the internet yesterday, so.
Yeah, and I do believe, us as data professionals, our role is to make that as easy as possible, right? So it's frictionless, and if you make it too hard, what I've found is people will find a way around the process,
Absolutely.
right? And so how do we make it easy? How do we use technology? How do we simplify processes? How do we, just make that role easy to do so that you get better data in the end?
And some of the
right?
challenge, though, is just what Tom was talking about. People are so embedded in old processes and ways of doing things, and they think, I have to fill out that form. We try to automate as much of the entry and processing of the data as possible to help with the quality and the errors. But they still don't trust it unless they see that somebody wrote it down and handed it to them. So that is, as we're transforming and as we're trying to become a data-driven and data-focused organization, it's getting by those old processes, having people let go. Another challenge we have, though, is, sometimes everybody doesn't get a vote. And that is, we seem to want to do things everything by committee. And sometimes when you are trying to advance and integrate new technology and new capability, well, you didn't ask me. I'm not ready for that. My process won't work with that. Sometimes we just have to, be big girls and boys and move on and embrace the new processes, the new technology, the new way of doing things. And that is, people have this significant emotional event sometimes when you tell them, hey, I'm moving you off of this platform to this platform, or you're not going to use, Access anymore. We have something better for you. And, it's, you upset their apple cart,
So
dump out their Cheerios.
It's funny you mention that, because I had this happen to me the other day. So as we move into a digital environment and a digital culture, we're creating words for the old stuff, right? Anyone heard the term wet signature, right? You know what that is? This is what we used to do, was just sign things. And so I got this document the other day, and you need to do a wet signature on it. So we have a task management system, and I can check out the PDF and I can digitally sign it. I'm like, no, you need to print it and sign it and scan it and put it back in. And I'm like, my God, why? Right? We just spent a ton of money to automate this entire workflow, because that's what we do.
Yeah, that's right.
This is a hiring action, so it's got to have a signature. I'm like, well, it does have a signature. It says right there, right, with the date and time stamp, and it's non-reputable, and yada, yada, yada. So it's a cultural mindset, right?
Yeah.
And more importantly, not cultural, but you got to challenge the status quo, right? I just had a very painful conversation with one of my lieutenant colonels who's promotable, and I said, when do you get a promoting? And he shrugs his shoulders and said, I don't know, right? I'm like, well, how long does it take? He's like, it takes 200 days. My God, why does it take 200 days? Well, that's just how long it takes. Well, who can I call? Nobody. There's got to be someone I can call, right? Can I have my 3-star call there, 3-star, right? No. Well, how long have you been in the queue? I'm not entirely sure. Well, when does the clock start with the 200 days? So right? Well, we're not sure. God, that's nonsense. Come on, right?
Yeah.
Someone out here can fix that problem for me. So,
Yeah.
Or someone here. I don't know. Maybe it's a DLA problem. I doubt it.
No, it's not DLA.
Yeah, not on that one.
So
no.
going back to the culture question, could you share what was one of the biggest culture issues that you had to face and how you overcame it? So we give you some advice as well.
Well, I think going back, to what I was just talking about, we went through a tremendous business transformation years ago, and so we have our SAP system in, and it drove a lot of people to retirement, I'm going to tell you. But not that, but is again doing something new, doing it in a different way. So one of the holdouts we had is that every one of our supply chains operated on their own environments for data analytics. We provided data centralized, but they still hosted their own servers, and so we're moving away from that, and we're providing enterprise tools, because we as a J6 cannot support 30 different analytic tools out there. So we said we're going to this centralized platform. We're going to a central cadre of approved enterprise tools. And, we had some communications about it. We tried to educate people. For a year, we told them it was coming. And then, I dropped the hammer and said, okay, in 30 days, we're shifting over. And the world shook. And, people were hanging off cliffs and calling in and just unable to function. And so that, again, to that significant emotional event, it really derailed folks. They were like, we're going to be at a work stoppage. The world is ending. We cannot support the warfighter. Of course, that's the worst thing you say in an agency like ours. So we had to drop back. And even though we had educated, even though we had trained, even though we had said it was coming, I guess, part of what we're learning is, some of that is the hand-holding. And some of it, no matter how much you can disprove or prove out with the data, with facts, some of that emotional stuff you just can't overcome, and you have to really pay attention to that change management, that hand-holding, that helping them over the hump. And really providing that comfort factor. So I say sometimes my job is part psychoanalyst, part evangelist, part
educator,
hammer,
right?
educator. But
Counselor.
in this case, it was really, and it took me, not my team, but it took me, and still am, having weekly calls with this large group of people and hearing their concerns and telling, some of it's just saying it's going to be okay. This is how we're going to take care of that. And it helps, but that is something that we learned and dealt with.
Yeah, Teresa and I were talking when I met with her about a month ago, and we actually hired someone on the team whose job it was to do communication, training, change management, and it was probably 2 or 3 years into the program. Yes. It was not something that I inherently thought I was going to need, and then it became pretty obvious that we needed to kind of control how we were communicating ourselves and not and really putting a much more emphasis.
Yeah, we thought
on
that everybody was going to be throwing a party and saying, this is great, we're
New
ready, let's
technology,
do it. No, that's not the way it worked out.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned. So I was in training not so long ago, and there was this postulate that was made that you can't change a culture, but you can establish a new culture and have people adopt it. And I thought that was a fascinating premise, right? Because especially around data, right? We just had this with Win 10. It was fascinating to me. Everyone knew March 31st, like literally, like the toilets are going to start spinning backwards and whatnot, right? If we don't go to Win 10, right? 3 weeks before the due date, we get this phone call from our G3, which is really, really important to the Army. It says, hey, we can't go to Win 10 because we got this portal that won't work with Win 10. I'm like, where the heck have you guys been for the last 18 months?
Yeah.
And all the list of all the inventories of all the data calls, right, which is a different problem, the fact that we're doing data calls to get this information, right? But how it just came up now. How is this possible? Right, so we did these kind of gymnastics. I call IT gymnastics, right, to jump through hoops and get it working and whatnot. But it wasn't the fact that they didn't know, right? The problem is we approached Win 10 and we approached a lot of these data problems as an IT problem,
right?
And they're not, right? They're not even close to IT. If your mission partner, whomever that might be, whether it's your customer or whatever, isn't the person driving the change, we IT professionals are not going to have a whole lot of luck.
Exactly.
That's right.
And the one thing I'll note is we IT professionals are also mission partners, right? Because I hear this all the time with our cybersecurity guys. They want to be different, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's just IT data, right? Yeah. I logged in, you logged in, whatever, right? But they're the functional owners of the data, right? And not unlike my log community, which is run on SAP, or the financial community, which is also run, not sadly, but on SAP, right? But they don't talk to each other, right? So when we buy something from you, it goes into GFibs and it gets entered into Logzo or into ASIP or something like this, right? They're not linked together automatically, right? Well, the log community in the FMNC, for us, Financial Management Command, came to us and said, hey, we want to make them work together. I'm like, all right, well, we've been telling you that for years, but now that you're on board, let's do it, right? Yeah. And so now we're really starting to knock down some targets on these things. So you really got to get not necessarily the buy-in. You can't go to them and sell it on it, right? You got to get them in
it's gotta
the
be
process.
from day one.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
exactly.
our HR people were doing this. They have, I forget what they call them. They're called user juries.
Oh, that sounds ominous.
Well, but it's intentional. I mean, it's the same. It's like murder board, right? What are you doing with a murder board, right? But literally, the users, right, to the lions, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how often does that happen in the DoD or federal government, right? So I think it's brilliant, quite honestly. So
that is a good point, and that is one of the things we're learning. You know, whether it's we deployed thin and thick and zero clients not too long ago, and VDI, and you know, you cannot discount that adoption and exception and that culture piece. Yeah. And too often, like I said, I thought everybody was going to be excited about it, and we weren't sensitive enough to what it requires.
What do they
Even
say?
though you need to move forward, you have to consider that.
Yeah, that's saying that culture eats strategy for lunch,
Yeah.
you know, and it's really true. So let me ask one more question, and then maybe we can open it up. And it's really about the role of the Chief Data Officer as well. And if you know, one of the neat things about my job is now I get to work with many of SAP's customers and chief data officers, and I've been a chief data officer now 3 times, so it's been probably 15 years over 3 different positions. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that the role of the chief data officer is also changing. So again, 15 years ago, it was a lot about regulation, compliance, standards, right? But in this new role of the Chief Data Officer, it's more about value creation. It's about, in some cases, they're revenue-producing jobs. And there's a recent Gartner study that has 2 really interesting facts. One of them, they said that by 2026, 80% of all chief data officers' roles, their first priority is either value realization or revenue realization. And the second one they said was that 90% of all chief data officers will have the role of data ethics.
That's true.
And certainly in this day of, you know, everything that's been going on with data and Facebook and others, you know, this whole idea of what is a data ethics policy and what is the role. And so so maybe you as practicing chief data officers, what do you think are the right skills that this new chief data officer needs to have in the future?
Do you want to go first?
absolutely, it'll be my pleasure. So there's a couple things that I really tried to focus in on. So I chose, I guess, to fuse architecture and data together, because I think it's really,
idea.
I think it's really important to have the data to be driving the architecture, and more importantly, using the architecture data to kind of drive decisions. And so creating a decision-based culture around data, or a data-driven decision cycle. But I think you need to have a little data scientist in you, right? You have to have quite a lot of psychotherapist in you. But there's this, you know, in the federal government is using ECQs, right? It's building coalitions, right? You can be results driven, but if you're breaking a lot of China and not cleaning it up, it's called the Scorched Earth policy, right? We tried that in the 50s, didn't work so well, right? So you really got to bring people together and help them understand why it's important for them to share with each other. I had a very kind of surreal experience just recently where our G2, which is the intelligence people, came to me and said, "Hey, I want to work with you." And I'm like, "Really? That's a first." Like, no one comes to me, no one comes to the 6 and say, "We want to work with you," right?
Yeah.
It's usually us doing it to them, right? And so I always say, don't let this become a moment where we're doing it to them or we get it done to us. Let's work together, collaborate to make it happen. So I think that kind of negotiating skill is really important. You really do have to understand data. You have to understand technology. You have to understand how to free the data technologically and not get sold into the shiny little object syndrome that we suffer from all the time. But that's really, I mean, that's important. It's really important, but it's not the bulk of my job by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, and I agree. So in our case, it's a bit different. The architecture piece, and when I refer to architecture, I'm talking about all the things that the servers and the cloud and I don't deal with that. I don't want to deal with that. I tell them it makes my eyes roll back in my head. I need to know and I need to understand, but I'm not the one architecting. I tell them these are the capabilities I need. This is the data I want to get to. This is what I need to do with it. Now you design the solution. I'm not going to design the solution for you from a technical component, but I need to have that data. I need to be able to move out on it. So this is a framework in which I need to operate. I think that in our perspective, like I said, I came from the logistics background, and that's been a tremendous asset for me because I know the business. I know the business, I was respected in the business, and especially starting this transformation, that was what was needed in our position and capabilities is someone who knows what type of knowledge that the agency needs to make some decisions. But I think that you do have to be an evangelist, a change manager, and be able to pull a team together. Like I said, we're a new team and we grew very fast. And it's being able to build those relationships, not only within your team and within your agency, but now we're talking across agencies and across departments and how we can partner up together and leverage technology and leverage and share our data. So it's consensus building also.
Yeah, and I would say what I would add is you also have to be really resilient. And you can't take no for an answer. So for me, no always meant not yet. You know, I just haven't come around to my way of thinking yet.
Yes,
exactly. Exactly. All right, well, maybe we can open up for the audience to see if there's any questions from the audience. Oh, yeah, there's one.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name's Anitra Reed, and I work for a small legislative agency in the federal government. I'm a safety and occupational health specialist. For those of you who don't know what that means, that's OSHA. But before I worked at my former agency, I worked for the Army for 20 years as a civilian, so it's good to see you here. So before I ask my question, I have to put a little context to it. I manage injury and illness stats for our agency, and we're in the process of the data-driven culture. The incident report is electronic. It's in a SharePoint site, and the data on that report is migrated into our incident reporting dashboard. One of the challenges is that the safety professionals don't always put all of the information that's needed on the incident report, so there are gaps that are reflected on a dashboard. I heard what Ms. Smith said about the emotional piece, and sometimes I think my director thinks I'm emotional, but it's not about emotion, it's about accuracy. There doesn't seem to be an appreciation or balance, a need to balance the automated to someone that can analyze the data. And an example is, okay, the incident reports, there's a default time on the electronic site. Sometimes the specialists don't complete it. The default time is midnight, so automatically generated into the dashboard are accidents that appear to have occurred at midnight, but they did not because they didn't complete the form. But then when I do the manual review, I can look at the form instantly. It didn't happen, you know, we're not having all of these incidents at midnight, they're just not completing this section. But with the data-driven culture in our agency, there appears to be no appreciation for the manual. Oh, we want to get away from the manual because we want it to be error-free. Well, it's not error-free. I think there needs to be a balance. So how do you address the need and the importance for the balance as we move toward the data-driven culture?
So I would just offer there's a couple of things. I mean, obviously training is one, right? But mobility might be one that would help you, right? So give them the form in the field when they're actually doing their whatever their analysis is, and don't allow them to enter the time, right? Right? And then also when you submit the form, if it's got filled with a bunch of default values or blank values, either prompt them or don't let them do it and say, hey, are you sure did it really happen at midnight? Your last 5 forms said that you had all these things at midnight, right? And it might, that's a little simplistic, don't get me wrong, because we get this with the unit status reports too, right? Every unit starts with A and every unit is a top block, and because that's the order in the drop down, right?
So we're getting the
getting the hook.
So we're all here. So if you'd like to maybe talk to us later, that'd be great. I have some ideas for you as well. So thank you, everybody. Back to